What I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by talking about this gentleman. I don't know how many of you know him, but this is what, many people get their history from Wikipedia, so this is what Wikipedia says about this gentleman. Cecil John Rhodes, 5th of July 1853 to the 26th of March 1902, was a British businessman, mining magnate and politician in southern Africa who served as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony from 1890 to 1896. An ardent believer in British imperialism, Rhodes and his British South Africa Company founded the South African territory of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia, which the company named after, modestly, named after him in 1895. South Africa's Rhodes University is also named after him. Rhodes set up the provisions of the Rhodes Scholarship, which is funded by his estate, and put much effort towards his vision of a Cape to Cairo railway through British territory. You can't, can you hear me? Okay. Oh, okay. Since I've said something about the Rhodes Scholarships, let me just refer you to their website and what the Rhodes Scholarships supposedly do. On their website, under the strapline "Our Vision," it says this: "Our mission is to identify and develop leaders to achieve public good. This is what the Rhodes Scholarships have done with remarkable success since its inception in 1903. Excuse me. And then under a heading of a second century of impact, it says this: "We find, bring together and develop exceptional young people who are impatient with the way things are and have the courage to act. Each year, a class of 100 scholars is selected from over 60 countries, maintaining a community of 250 scholars studying at Oxford at any one time. The combination of a collaborative and dynamic environment, and challenging with a challenging education and a focus on character, service and leadership prepares them to make a positive impact on the world." And it goes on to describe how Rhodes Scholars are committed to lasting change and how the trust, the Rhodes Trust, quote, reflects the world's diversity. And interestingly, part of my research, amongst the Americans who have benefited from a Rhodes Scholarship are Chris Christopherson, the musician, Naomi Wolf, the feminist writer and activist, and perhaps most famously, the former President Bill Clinton. So, wonderful words and a wonderful vision, and clearly some wonderful people have benefited from Rhodes Scholarship. But in addition to the Rhodes Scholarships, Rhodes left £100,000 to Oriel College in Oxford, from which was built the Rhodes Building, which faces the High Street, complete with that statue of him, and it bears the inscription in Latin, "By means of the generous munificence of Cecil Rhodes." And similarly, those of you who were here earlier and will have saw protests that were taking place on the bit of film footage that I showed you, that was at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, which is built on land that was bequeathed by the Rhodes family. So, given such munificence, to use their own words, you might expect that the beneficiaries of such generosity would respond to that generosity with nothing but praise and respect. Problem is this: there is an alternative view of Cecil Rhodes, and in recent years, it has clearly not been the case that the beneficiaries of Rhodes Scholarships have all been grateful and have praised him for providing them with an opportunity to study at such august institutions. Instead, the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which I'm going to talk about, began on that very campus in Cape Town that was built on Rhodes land. So I showed you that bit of earlier film footage. I'm going to show you another bit of footage in a short while, because having started at the University of Cape Town, having started in South Africa, the Rhodes Must Fall movement has spread internationally and indeed has come over to this country and has been taken up in particular by students at Oxford University. And indeed, one of the leading figures, one of the people who set up the campaign here in this country, was himself a Rhodes Scholar. I apologise if I pronounce his name incorrectly. It's Ntokosi Kwabe. Let me tell you a little bit about Kwabe, because he has been heavily criticised for supposedly being a complete hypocrite, for happily taking Rhodes's money and then condemning the man. He was someone, Kwabe, he was born to poor parents in a rural part of KwaZulu-Natal. He's one of 13 children and was one of the first to go to university, but because he couldn't afford to stay there, he left and had to get various jobs. He worked in a drugs checkout store, for example. Managed through that to get enough money together to complete his first degree, a law degree. He then did a master's degree at the University of Cape Town before then coming to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. So in short, therefore, he does appear to be someone who has benefited from the generosity of Rhodes and the Rhodes Trust. It doesn't sound much like this, because let's hear what he has to say himself.
Is Oriel College. 2016 should see an answer as to whether it will be pulled down following a year of campaigning.
It is disgusting that I, as a person who comes from South Africa in particular, where Rhodes committed all these crimes, have to walk past this.
Ntokosi Kwabe, who leads the Rhodes Must Fall campaign, has faced criticism in the British press recently. As a beneficiary of the Rhodes Scholarship himself, he's been described as hypocritical for trying to remove the statue.
We cannot say that suddenly all the crimes and all the structural violence that was done to the continent are somehow cleaned away simply because a few Africans can access actually money that was theirs in the first place to come to this space. We think that is totally nonsensical.
Oriel College says the values of Cecil Rhodes stand in absolute contrast to the ethos of the scholarship programme and university. A temporary display has gone up below the statue, saying it does not condone or glorify the views or actions of Cecil Rhodes. But this isn't just about a statue. Ntokosi says the celebration of Cecil Rhodes can be felt in many aspects of student life at the university.
The structural violence is like the curriculum, the lack of black professors. Those things are not just exceptions. They go to the very heart of how Oxford is configured and how Oxford as a space is, to be quite frank, racist. And this is what we are saying, that blatant violence and assault and racism is unacceptable at a university that purports to be inclusive.
These views are not held by all Rhodes scholars, and some analysts believe the campaigners are using history for modern-day political purposes.
The idea that modern-day Oxford University is in any way racist or oppressive is nonsense, and the people making these claims are clearly insincere.
Oriel College says it is doing more to improve the experience for black and minority ethnic students, and over the next 6 months will seek views from alumni, heritage bodies, Oxford City Council and the public on the future of the Cecil Rhodes statue. Campaigners here say they're not trying to change history, simply the celebration of Cecil Rhodes. The university will be hoping that its 6-month listening exercise will finally provide some answers on how to deal with a controversial aspect of its past. Dan Whitehead, SABC News, Oxford.
You might just think that Kwabe represents precisely the kind of bright, talented person who is impatient for change, who Cecil Rhodes would want to be funding through his university education. But it should be absolutely clear from what he said there that this isn't just a protest, some kind of tokenistic protest about symbols and the removal of symbols from universities. It's something much deeper and much more fundamental than that, because statues don't just appear of their own accord, do they? They don't just appear out of nowhere. They are lobbied for, they are funded, they are erected for a particular purpose, to say something about the world that we live in and the world that we ought to celebrate. And of course they're usually erected, as in this case, by rich and powerful people, supposedly to offer, in this case with his own money, to present and to celebrate a particular legacy, all because there is a political consensus that these are people who should be celebrated. And so therefore, you know, one other very famous statue, other person I'm going to talk about, is someone you may not have heard of, Cecil Rhodes. You certainly, or if you haven't been listening in your history lessons properly, you'll certainly have heard about Winston Churchill. Who, this isn't Wikipedia, this is on the official government web page about Winston Churchill, was, and I quote, an inspirational statesman, a writer, orator and leader who led Britain to victory in the Second World War. He is widely recognised as Britain's greatest ever Prime Minister, having led the country twice from 1940 to 45 and again from 51 to 55, and despite decades of service, even found time to publish many works and won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So again, a truly great man, it would appear. The problem is, the truth is about both of these dead white men, is that there is an alternative view. There's an alternative history about them. Let's look at Rhodes first of all. And let me return to that rather tricky comment in the Wikipedia profile about him being an ardent believer in British imperialism. What he actually believed was this, and I quote, "I contend that we are the first race in the world, and that the more of the world that we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." So, having been sent to work on his brother's farm in South Africa in 1870, he set about putting that idea of dominating the world into practice. This was, of course, during the scramble for Africa. Most of the continent at the time when he went there in 1870 was actually run and ruled by Africans. But by the time of his death in the early 20th century, almost the entire continent was under the control of rich white people like Cecil Rhodes, very prominent amongst them. And the success that he achieved was based upon bribery, bullying, and the most violent barbarity. He bought the Diamond Company De Beers and set about consolidating his power by seizing control, imposing taxes, viciously exploiting, and I quote, niggers who were required to mine the diamonds. Workers were systematically flogged, kept in chains. When their contracts had finished, they used to be fitted with these big leather gloves which were locked at the elbow to prevent them stealing some of the diamonds and making away with them. And that having established control through control of the mining fields, he, as the profile said, he became an MP, he became Prime Minister of a part of the territory. He set about really trying to take control of the whole of South Africa. Didn't succeed in grabbing the whole of South Africa, but part of the legacy not simply was seizing and taking control of and establishing Rhodesia, as it was called, but setting the legacy for what became apartheid South Africa from 1948. The policies that became the policies of apartheid South Africa were very much pioneered by Rhodes in that part of the continent. So he didn't succeed in capturing the whole of the territory that he fought for, but he did, as I say, manage to set up Zimbabwe. What of Churchill? a man who was so obsessed with how history presented himself and how history would judge him that he wrote it himself. That's how he came to be a Nobel laureate, because he wrote his own history, characterising himself as the great man who supposedly was our finest prime minister. But again, like Rhodes, a rampant, racist, imperialist bully, opposed women's suffrage movement. He formed the Black and Tans, which brutally oppressed the Irish independence movement. He was strongly in favour of using poison gas against so-called uncivilised tribes and ordered the use of it against Turkish rebels in 1920. In 1943, so by which time, of course, he is the Prime Minister, he declared, "I hate Indians," and so much so that, you know, they are a beastly people with a beastly religion, and as a consequence, despite the fact that there were vast amounts of grain in India and available at the time, because of his policies, 5 million people died in Bengal during a famine in that year. Moreover, you know, our great leader, this was the man who had no great hatred of fascism. He told Mussolini in 1927, "Your movement has rendered a service to the whole world. If I had been Italian, I should have been wholeheartedly with you from start to finish in your triumphant struggle against the bestial passions of Leninism." And later he said about Hitler that he had a perfect right to be a patriotic German if he wanted to. I wanted Germany, England and France to be friends. So his commitment to fighting the war was not because of some great ideological opposition to fascism. It was about seeking desperately to protect and preserve the British Empire. So I think it should be clear that from that brief potted history, but also from the comments you heard from Kwabe, that the Rhodes Must Fall campaign and the campaign about all of these kind of statues is part of a wider campaign and struggle for an interpretation of history. So, you know, I think it's distressing enough. You know, if you think about it, it is distressing enough for students at the University of Cape Town to be educated on premises that were seized from through the brutal repression of their ancestors. It is a disgrace that you have to go into libraries where you ought to feel grateful to people like Rhodes. It's understandable that people feel oppressed by that. People may have heard, one of the books on sale here that I would encourage people to read is Afua Hirsch's book called British. She's a very interesting person because she herself, by her own admission, is someone who had a relatively privileged background, relatively privileged upbringing. She grew up in Wimbledon, the home of the Strawberries and Cream tennis tournament that's going on at the moment that we're aware of. But, you know, quite a posh part of London. She went to public school. She studied at Oxford University. Indeed, she was and remains friends with a number of people who are Rhodes scholars. Subsequently qualified as a barrister. She left that. She became a correspondent on The Guardian, a correspondent on Sky News. Quite a well-to-do background. She gave all of that up to become a freelance journalist, and she wrote her book, British, which really is part of a kind of lifelong search for her own identity because she's of mixed heritage. Her mother is Ghanaian, and what that meant, therefore, part of that search for identity was that whilst she was at Oxford, she, not surprisingly, wanted to research and study and find out more about African history. Yet she points out that, to quote her, there is something disturbing about the fact that in order to research aspects of the Ashanti Wars, you need to sit beside the statue of a glorious slave master. That person, not Rhodes, it's Christopher Codrington, whose family owned huge tracts of Barbados, include sugar plantations worked by slaves. It was a bequest from that family, from his trust, that created the library at All Souls, one of the grandest of colleges at Oxford University. So in order to study this, you have to sit in a library that was the bequest of that slave owner. So really what I'm saying is that the control that these benefactors and their friends and their lobbyists have that helps to create this view that paints and preserves their contribution to society as having been a progressive and positive contribution. And of course, the timing of the bequest is interesting because the Rhodes Trust was set up almost immediately after his death in order to, if you like, present that first draft of history, present and preserve that first draft of history of Rhodes as being a progressive man. And indeed, as I've already indicated, Churchill literally himself wrote the first draft of the history of his contribution, the one that presents him as being our greatest prime minister. So, interestingly, at the time, the British electorate treated him with disdain by voting him out and voting in the Labour government that came into power from 45 to 51. It's only later, and partly thanks to his own hand, that he was granted the iconic status that he now has, the erection of the statue to him in 1973, the opening of his war rooms in the 1980s, and the revered status that he now has. Looking elsewhere, let's think about America and think about all of the statues of those Confederate generals that we see in various southern states, one of which, of course, a protest against one of which in Charlottesville culminated in the murder of the anti-racist activist Heather Heyer last year, murder by someone who was a professed fascist. And you'll recall, of course, Donald Trump's intervention into that debate, infamously equating the violence of anti-racist protesters with the violence of the fascists who were there to protect and preserve the Confederate statue, and the characterization of some of the people on that Confederate supporting protesters, good people. Compare that with what he said about the National Football League footballers taking a knee to protest against racism and to support the Black Lives Matter movement. He characterized them not as good men, but as sons of bitches who should be kicked out by the owners of their teams. But he went on to not only characterize these people as good people, but inevitably in a tweet, because that's all he does, isn't it? He said this: "It is sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart by the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it." Now, I think there are a number of things that should be said about that. Firstly, those monuments are not part of some never-changing, long-settled part of America's history. Most of them actually are pretty cheap and nasty. And part of the reason they're cheap and nasty was because they were erected very quickly and hastily in the period after, essentially, in the Jim Crow era, to try and settle and preserve the idea of Southern independence, Southern freedom, opposition to the northern states and so on. So the monuments went up as a deliberate way of recasting people like Robert E. Lee, the person whose statue was being protested against in Charlottesville, attempt to present them as being warriors in the fight for freedom and to protecting this idea of state rights against federal bureaucracy. By way of another example, there were at least 109 schools in 15 states which are named after Confederate generals like Robert Lee, Stonewall Jackson, or the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. In 27 of those schools, the majority of students are African American. 39 of those schools were built between the 1950s and this is how recent it is, between the 1950s and the 1970s. In other words, this is during the high point of the civil rights movement that these schools are being named after Confederate generals. So you just consider the indignity for those students who have to walk through the doors, through the halls of those schools under plaques celebrating these people. So I think it follows from this that those people aren't seeking to, what they're seeking to, people who are seeking to bring down the statues are not saying, thank you, that we shouldn't learn from history. Not at all that we shouldn't learn from history. What they're pointing to is the fact that history isn't simply what is handed down to us by, the official history books, by the official chronicles, but rather it is something that is challenged, it is something that is contested, and that the world is something that was created by a far more dynamic process than the good works of a few good dead white men, the people who are invariably commemorated in these kinds of monuments. You take the very subject of slavery. Here in Britain, we're told, aren't we, it was because of William Wilberforce and the good things that he did in Parliament. Or in America, slavery recognised as being America's original sin, the basis upon which its original prosperity as a capitalist country was developed. But, of course, that's in the past. America is now the land of the free, the land of opportunity, the land where everyone can prosper. And the reason is because of the actions of the great emancipator, as he's called, because Abraham Lincoln passed a proclamation abolishing slavery in 1863. In fact, if you watch Steven Spielberg's award-winning film, one of the things that annoyed me so much is right at the beginning of the film, you see a little bit of the Civil War, and two black soldiers come up to Lincoln and basically plead with him to pass a proclamation because it's that is going to get rid of slavery. Not the fact that hundreds of thousands themselves fought for their own liberation, joined the army precisely because they believed that this was the means by which they were going to achieve their liberation. Time and time again, the message that is presented is that it's the works of these few good men that change and shape history. You would think that black people had nothing to do with, just nothing but a passive role in their liberation, that we suffered the privations of slavery without challenge. Of course, the great Trinidadian Marxist and writer C.L.R. James tells a very different story. Indeed, his masterwork, The Black Jacobins, I think is one of the finest attempts to present that alternative view of history. He argued, the idea that the docile Negro is a complete myth. He argued instead, and I quote, that the Negro's revolutionary history is rich, inspiring, and unknown. That's why he wrote the Black Jacobins, because it's unknown. Negroes revolted against slave raiders in Africa. They revolted against the slave traders on the Atlantic Passage. They revolted on the plantations. The only place where Negroes did not revolt is in the pages of capitalist historians. That's what C.L.R. James wrote. And it's that vision, recognising that alternative vision of history, that these kind of protests really are about. That, I think, in essence, is why the likes of the Rhodes Must Fall campaign were established. What they want is not to, whitewash or blackwash history, pretend that these people didn't exist. It's to have a real debate about history, where history comes from, and about the struggles, not just actually the struggles that we face, but the contributions that we have made to culture, to science, and so forth. And moreover, I think they are generous enough, therefore, to recognise they don't want to completely write off Rhodes and Churchill. Let's talk about Rhodes and Churchill, but let's talk about the whole, the real Rhodes and Churchill. Thank you very much. And I think that when you put it in that context, it destroys one of, really the most ludicrous arguments. The arguments, was it Douglas Murray who was on that clip? The kind of arguments that you hear, which is that we shouldn't condemn Rhodes and Churchill or the Confederate generals and so on, because they were men of their time. Yeah, they were men of their time, and they weren't necessarily any worse than other people at the time. Well, quite possibly they were considerably worse, but also, of course, they were incredibly powerful. So what they did mattered and made a huge difference to the lives of millions of people. So I would argue, therefore, that the likes of Kwabe were not being disrespectful and ungrateful. He is entitled to argue, as he and the students on the University of Cape Town and others were doing, was that what they were doing was, he argued, you know, occupying this land is trying to reclaim what was stolen, in reparations, if you like, what was stolen from our ancestors through blood, sweat and tears in the first place. And it's worth adding, actually, it's interesting, isn't it, that at the forefront of the struggle in Oxford are largely, to be honest, foreign students, people like him. One of the reasons I think that is not entirely surprising is because, as David Lammy exposed in his studies, that you'd struggle to find very many black British-born students at Oxford University. There are colleges that haven't offered a place to a single black student for the last decade. That tells you something, of course, about the continued existence of institutional racism in our society. And it isn't just restricted. I think what one of the interesting developments is that the protests and campaign and what they stand for isn't just restricted to university campuses. One of the most interesting and enjoyable things that I saw in the last couple of weeks was that in Bristol, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a campaign of opposition. There's been a group called Countering Colston, and they persuaded the Lord Mayor there, Councillor Cleo Lake, to remove a portrait of the slave trader Edward Colston from her office. And I think that, you know, if these kinds of protests and campaigns are going to have a lasting impact, then they do need to not just be campus-based campaigns. They can't just be campaigns about the removal of statues, because that would just be tokenistic. They have to be part of a wider political debate and discussion, part of the growth and development of movements like Black Lives Matter, and part of the wider struggle for a different and a better society. I need to wind up, so let me just tell you a little bit about where things are, because I'm going to begin where I kind of started with the students on campuses, because when Rhodes Must Fall first began in Oxford in 2016, the university issued the following statement. Oxford University is committed to improving the experience of minority ethnic students. We are already working with students on a range of actions, including diversification of the curriculum, and would welcome Rhodes Must Fall participation. We have invited Rhodes Must Fall to meet senior university members to discuss their concerns. They have not yet responded, but the university hopes they will take this opportunity to make progress on the issues that they raised. That's December of 2015, I think it was. In any event, the following month, January, the college, Oriel College, not the university, issued this statement. 28th of January 2016, so the original one must have been December 2015. Statement from Oriel College regarding the college's decision concerning the Rhodes statue. Over the past few months, there has been intense debate about how Cecil Rhodes is commemorated in Oxford, and particularly about the Rhodes statue on Oriel College's High Street frontage. Oriel believes that the issue needs to be addressed in a spirit of free speech and open debate, with a readiness to listen to divergent views. The college's intention by releasing its statement in December was to open debate and listen to the response. Since that announcement, we have received an enormous amount of input, including comments from students and academics, alumni, heritage bodies, national and student polls, and a further petition, as well as over 500 direct written responses to the college. The overwhelming message we have received has been in support of the statue remaining in place for a variety of reasons. Following careful consideration, the college's governing body has decided that the statue should remain in place and that the college will seek to provide a clear historical context to explain why it's there. And notable, actually, amongst the people who were criticising, I'm just beginning to finish, was Professor Mary Beard, who unhelpfully, and I think a misguided comment, said that the battle isn't won by taking away the statue and pretending those people don't exist, as if that's what the campaign was about. It's won by empowering those students to look up at Rhodes and friends with a cheery and confident sense of unbatterability. And the university's chancellor, the former Tory party chair, and for those who don't know, former governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patten, lectured students about freedom of thought and suggested if they are unable to embrace it, then they should think about being educated elsewhere. That's what Chris Patten had to say. Now, I need to finish. A cynic might think that the decision to retain the statue was linked to the threatened removal of various donations. There was one, in fact, the Daily Telegraph of all publications got hold of a letter showing that one donation of £500,000 had already been lost, another of £750,000 was being reconsidered, and a major donor whose legacy might be as much as 100 million was furious with the college over its decision simply to consult about whether the statue should remain. You wonder who those people are. So in short, and in conclusion, Rhodes hasn't fallen, and Churchill continues to look down imperiously from his perch. So the struggle goes on, and all power to them.
Yeah, it's far more than just statues, of course, though we can go on from that. I was glad to hear Brian mention Bristol. There's a very good history about Bristol's involvement in the slave trade by Madge Dresser, who also wrote the brilliant Black and White on the Buses, which bookmarks were printed a couple of years ago. And it's called Slavery Obscured, because of how brilliant the great and the good of Bristol are at obscuring how much all of the wealth of their city came out of slavery, which is why they're so reluctant to admit these things. It's why Edward Colston's statue is still in the middle of Colston Avenue, going down the middle of Bristol's thoroughfare, why there's still schools called Colston. They have renamed Colston Hall, or they're planning to, which I hear is a good thing. But it's interesting. Lots of campaigners have made great statements like, there is not one brick in this city that does not come from the blood of the slaves. And so many people that you talk to who love Bristol, oh, I love Bristol, what they mean is Georgian Bristol. All of those beautiful villas and stuff, which of course we can't afford to live in, but, you know, they're all built on the blood of the slaves, the profits of the Bristol traders and Bristol merchants from their role in transporting the slaves in the slave trade. And of course, Bath's only 10 miles down the road. You know, that was the great watering hole of the rich in the 18th century in particular. And again, that's the case. And surprisingly, even people who we're often told are not very political, like Jane Austen, proved that wasn't the case, because she did a really good indictment of the involvement of the slave trade in her novel Mansfield Park, which climaxes with the exposure of one of the main characters, how they've been completely traumatised by what they'd seen in their father's own slave colony. So there's all sorts of different areas of culture where imperialism has dominated and where there's a territory that we can fight over.
First, thank you so much, Brian. That was a really interesting talk. Two things I wanted to say. First of all, I think it's interesting that in French, the word for history and the word for story is the same, histoire. And I think that captures the fact that history is a version of events. It's obviously a myth that history is a kind of a concrete thing that happened. We all just tell stories, and it's dependent on language as well, the language that we use. And the second thing to say that in The History Boys by Weyman Bennett, there's a scene where the teacher points out that history is a way to remember, but it's also a way to forget. And I think the statues debate really shows that there's obviously it forgets the people who weren't part of the struggle or whatever, and it also forgets the kind of the misdemeanors and the shadows and complexities of the individuals remembered.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Fascinating talk. I just want to say that the question of public statues has always been part of the class struggle and the political struggle right the way through. In the Paris Commune, right, the great French artist Gustave Courbet was one of the people who was involved in the destruction, the pulling down of the Vendôme column, at the top of which stood Napoleon III. And so on. After the suppression of the Commune, he was put in jail for his part in bringing down that statue. In the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, they pulled down the statue of Stalin, left only his boots. Much better, much greatly improved work of art by this. You want to see how politics interacts with this? Just compare Trafalgar Square and the Central Street in Dublin, O'Connell Street. And Trafalgar Square, you've got Nelson's column, and you've got a series of statues of generals around the place. You go down O'Connell Street, you've got Parnell, you've got O'Connell, you've got the GPO, and most amazingly, you've got a statue of James Larkin, the great workers' leader, saying, "Let us rise." That you've got in O'Connell Street. You did have a Nelson's pillar in O'Connell Street, but the IRA blew it up in 1966, much to the improvement of the place. So it's always part of the political. So two quick points. The defenders of this claim took it a bit as if it was about art. Most of these publics, 99% of these statues are of no artistic merit, and nobody looks at them as art. You won't pay any attention. They're about politics. And the last thing about history, they say you're trying to change history. No. It's precisely because we know the history behind them that we don't want these bastards celebrated.
I think that was so interesting, because statues, they're sort of like the first step, aren't they, to how history is being changed and is being rewritten. Yeah, okay, history happened, but how we talk about history now affects, the history it does. Because if you pick and choose what history you want to remember and what history you want to forget, that is changing history. And it changes the future as well. Because if you've got Winston Churchill stood there, future generations are going to see that and remember it. And as we get further and further away from history and what actually happened, we get further and further away from the truth. And I think if we look again to America, so Mount Rushmore, presidents in the mountain, that's Native American, sacred land that they've put 4 presidents on. It's rewriting history, and I guess like a white man's history it is. You've got books in America teaching children that the Native Americans gave their land to the European colonists. It's just wrong, and the statue argument is the first argument to beating history being rewritten and people being forgotten who we should really be celebrating.
Excuse me. Brian, I'm sorry, I wonder if I could just hijack the meeting a little bit and talk a little bit about street names. And the reason I want to do that is because in Liverpool in the mid-90s there was a debate which was started off by Liverpool city councillors, in particular a Liberal Democrat councillor who wanted to change some of the names in Liverpool because they were named, as most of you will know, after people connected with the slave trade. As you know, Liverpool was turned from a sleepy fishing port into one of the main centres of slavery, and that was where it made all its wealth from, and all the rest of it. The debate was centred around the fact that really to have our streets named after some of these characters was really bad for tourism, and it would put people off coming to the city. There was a tremendous lobby at the time against the changes, and the first lobby came from Beatles fan clubs, because I don't know whether people know this, that one of the most photographed street names in the world is Penny Lane. Now, the Beatles never knew this themselves, and not many people did, to be quite honest, that James Penny, who this street was named after, was a merchant in the slave trade. He was mayor of Liverpool twice. His son was mayor of Liverpool, and he made his wealth from the slave trade. He was an advocate of the slave trade, so much so that he took a report with him down to the various commissions involved in the slave trade looking into. He took a report down to London and said, in fact, that slavery was actually good for slaves, and the slaves on his ships were treated better than people and the crew who slept on shore. So that was the first lobby. The point I'm making is that the councillors who, whatever their intention to it, did not know the extent of the slave trade themselves and its involvement in Liverpool. James Penny was a guy who at that time involved in slavery was trying to cover up the extent of slavery, and that's been in 1957 the official report of Liverpool, which is a big thick book, gave just 2 paragraphs to slavery. The second paragraph said that slavery was good for slaves. So then anti-racists got involved, and the point I'm making is that, and the point that they made was that it wasn't that people would be put off by these characters, these street names. The point was that people even today didn't know the involvement that these people had, and really what we should be doing is putting the blue plaque under these, actually not just a few names, but actually dozens and dozens and dozens of people who they didn't know were involved in slavery. We should put a blue plaque under their names and say who these characters really were, and where they made their wealth from, and that was the argument which took place.
Broke the microphone. I think one of the arguments that the right wing used quite effectively, actually, and Brian touched on it, is the argument that we need to know who these people are. We can't just rewrite history. We need to know who they were and what they did and all the rest of it. The trouble is, it's not a level playing field, and you don't. Most people, and lots of students who go to university will not know who Cecil Rhodes was, and there's a bloody big statue of it. And actually, we do need to reclaim their history. The comrade who just spoke about the blue plaque actually saying underneath this person was a slave trade is a really good idea, actually, because one of the questions I was going to ask was, how do we start reclaiming that in our own right? Do we create our own art? Do we create our own things that show our history, and how do we do that? And I think, but what people have done in the campaigns, for me, I wasn't totally convinced about it at first, actually. It's totally inspirational, what Brian talked about, and seeing some of the footage of people in America actually taking down Confederate statues, really being part of a movement that says our lives matter, our history matters, is really important. But I wanted to, but I did want to ask a couple of questions. Sorry. Anyway, we don't... And I think in the film at the beginning there was a bit where you showed a woman, I think it was in South Africa, daubing a photograph with paint in an art gallery. And I'm not necessarily in favour of doing that. There's a fantastic portrait of Churchill, I think, by Graham Sutherland, which is a beautiful portrait. And the guy's a complete bastard. I think he actually captures that a bit in the portrait because Churchill hated it. But I think, you wouldn't go around, I wouldn't go to the National Gallery and slash it. But I would try and make sure that people knew about Churchill, and I think there's a sort of I'm a bit confused still about this. I can see the whole point about statues perfectly. They're horrible, they're hideous, they're not art, most of them. They're just cheap trash. But I do think there's sort of, if somebody tried to do something similar to a work of art, I'm not sure how I'd feel about it or how I'd respond to it. I'd probably support them, but be a little bit cautious about it. And I've got one question for Brian at the end, which is about, there was a thing on the television the other day. It's in Romania. It's a Soviet-era building which was set up for some great trade fair or something. It's circular. It's totally modern. It's the most awesome-looking building you'd ever see. And inside, it's completely covered with Soviet-era mosaics, lauding the workers and all the rest of it, right? And it's been derelict since the fall of the Soviet Empire. And I think there's an argument in Romania about, do we let it go or do we restore it? And actually, I think that's quite an interesting argument in a way. Is that do we actually restore it so we can actually look at this period of our history and say this is what happened, or we do let the whole thing go derelict? And I totally understand why people would pull down a statue of Stalin, but I'm not quite so sure that we'd actually try and get rid of this absolutely beautiful building, all the horrible mosaics, politically horrible mosaics in the Russian underground system.
Hi there. I think somebody earlier was talking about Jane Austen, and I think in literature it's very important to recognise the struggle. I mean, I'm thinking of somebody called Fred Degar, who wrote a book called Feeding the Ghosts, about a real event, the sinking of, the Zong, the ship called the Zong, in which slaves were thrown from it for insurance purposes and so on. And in relation to that, I've read quite extensively the work of Marcus Rediker, who I know has spoken at Bookmarks in the past, and his whole raison d'etre is history from below, our history. And I'm thinking also, when I think of that, I get inspired to be active and to get out on Friday next, for example, and to stand up against Trump, not least for what Brian has said earlier about what he did at Charlottesville. But I also think names are really important. And my mother, she came from a place called Winegap in County Kilkenny. And near Winegap is a town called Callan. And in Callan, there's something called the Cherry Field. Now, I found out by accident, visiting my mum who was ill, and she was in a care home. And I went to the Cherry Field. And what I found out was that thousands of people are buried there because they died in the workhouse, or as a result of being in the workhouse. And over a period from the famine in Ireland, we're talking about 10, 15 years, people must have been wheeled down there day by day, because it took me half an hour to walk from the workhouse to the graveyard. And I'm also thinking of Palestinians who've died in Gaza recently, but over the whole piece, 70 years. Where are their names? Do we speak them out? I know people have spoken them out. Actors, for example, I think Mark Rylance and others have done this in the past. But we need to keep our names. And the last thing I will say is I have a friend who is the chair of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in North Devon, Rothio. She was over with her father, who died recently, and in the conversation when I was talking to her, expressing my, condolences and so on, she said, my father wrote a book when he was in the Spanish Civil War. And I said, oh, is it translated into English? She said, no. So that's something that we're going to find out about. One of us who wrote a book about history as we want to remember it also, not those who are giving it to us, as you said.
I just want to re-emphasize the importance of these campaigns and offer a few victories we've had in Canada. First Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, terrible person, created the residential school system to, quote, kill the Indian in the child, to separate and tear people from their language and culture. So there have been many successful campaigns within Canada to tear down statues of him, which has been great. Based on the idea of place names, there have been a lot of other really positive victories. The Queen Charlotte Islands have now been renamed to Haida Gwaii to reflect the traditional people who live there. Mount Douglas Park, named after Sir James Douglas, the first governor of Vancouver Island, has now been renamed to Pecoles to, again, reflect the language of the people who live there. There's one other, and the Strait of Juan de Fuca, so the landmass, or the water between Vancouver Island and mainland British Columbia, has been renamed the Coast Salish Sea, again to reflect the indigenous population that have lived there well beyond the colonial project of Canada. So these are just a few examples of successful projects to inspire and hopefully, project more enthusiasm.
Restoration of Charles II in 1660 was followed almost immediately by an Act of Parliament, and it was called the Act of Oblivion. Okay, and the key wording in that phrase was, we will forget about the late disturbances of the last 20 years. The late disturbances, of course, being the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, and the only, unfortunately, time in this country when we've actually had a republic. And it was enacted with the very specific intention of actually saying, forget about these things, they didn't happen, we don't want to go on. Now, of course, they weren't forgotten. Royalists, predictably sort of used the period to take revenge, essentially, for what had happened to them during the Civil War, to reclaim their lands. It didn't actually include some of the regicides who were hung, drawn and quartered in particularly gruesome manner and so on and so forth. But the basic intention of it was fairly obviously not to forget and have peace and reconciliation, but to actually crush the sort of remnants of people like the Levellers, the Diggers, the Republicans, the people who fought against royal tyranny and all the rest of it. And I think that says quite a lot about what the state is doing and what the ruling class are doing when they're saying we need to remember these things and we need to and so on, because actually their version of remembering is actually remember the things that they want and not the things that we want to remember. And I think that's quite instructive. But it also raises up some questions, because despite that, actually there's a statue of Cromwell outside the House of Parliament these days. Now we might well read that as a positive idea. You know, he brought in parliamentary form of rule, albeit pretty imperfect, and effectively it became a kind of dictatorship anyway, but nonetheless represented a challenge to authority, and Cromwell's body was dug up and sort of displayed in public after the Restoration, by the way. But actually, again, in a sense, that's also quite problematic, isn't it? Because what would somebody in Ireland say about Cromwell, given the record of Cromwell's history in Ireland? And it does raise the whole question about what do we... you know, if you're remembering anything, you can't ever remember something in a sort of completely black, I'm about to say black or white, not a good word to use, positive or negative way, because there's all, you know, the point about remembering is to actually excavate the complexities, isn't it, and not just the sort of, you know, the sort of stereotype versions. However, I will end on one thing I think is a very good one, local one to me. I live in Hackney in Stoke Newington, just down the road in Newington Green, where Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote the Vindication of the Rights of Women, was worked and lived, and actually there has been a campaign for the last couple of years to actually put up a statue to her, and actually it's finally gone through, and Maggie Hambling has designed, I think, quite a nice design for it. And I do think we do want remembrances, but I'm not quite sure how, you know, what are we saying in the future about how we want to remember things? Will we have statues after the revolution?
I just want to say it's my first time actually speaking in Marxism, so let's see how this goes. Comrades, I just want to take a bit of a tangent to begin with about how Germany handles its past. So the Berlin Guardhouse was once a building asserting Prussian, later Nazi military dominance, as Pickelhaube and Stahlhelm-wearing soldiers frequently marched, showing the state's jingoism and nationalism. After the war, and as German militarism was smashed, it's now called the Central Memorial of the Federal Republic of Germany for the Victims of War and Dictatorship, with a statue inside of a mother cradling her dead son, grief-stricken and starving. This shows how we can preserve history, but not glorify it, and show history through the eyes of ordinary people, and not supposedly great men who rampantly oppress. We see this again with German war memorials, which once commemorated German soldiers who fell in the Great War, and now rededicated for all victims of all wars. This removes the nationalism often associated with commemoration of the wars. You know, you only have to look at Tommy Robinson supporters who are like, you know, supporting the troops in the war, protecting the legacy. So, hang on. So yeah, there is no pride in the wanton loss of millions of lives, and the lives of your countrymen are not valued over those of other lands. And of course, the ultimate manifestation of remembering but not glorifying is the concentration camps of Auschwitz, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, where you can go there. It's a quiet place of remembrance where, of course, millions were killed just for existing. What can we learn from this? Firstly, we cannot glorify imperialism, so statues of oppressors like Churchill and Rhodes must be torn down, but nor can we forget the horrors that these men committed. So as a result, we should focus on creating statues to represent the suffering caused by these vile men, like Germany does with its Nazi legacy, so we do not glorify the past, nor do we forget the crimes of history that so we do not repeat them again.
Yeah, the right-wing press have went predictably crazy about this, didn't they? And described us all as snowflakes, etc., for wanting to tear down statues. I don't recall them having the same attitude to pulling down Saddam Hussein's statue in Iraq, all the statues of Stalin, all the Berlin Wall, or anything else, which in general they think is a good idea to get rid of. So there's a complete double standard when it comes to that. But I want to talk about the other period. Brian mentioned the 1950s to the 1970s as one of the key periods in which statues were erected in the United States as monuments to the Confederate side in the American Civil War. The other key period is from the 1880s to the 1920s. Why did they choose that period to erect so many statues? To understand that, you have to understand that at the end of the Civil War, an enormous populist movement in the South united poor blacks and poor whites in a massive threat to the new order. And the erection of the statues was part of trying to create the mythology of a united white race in the South with its own separate traditions, which could be then used as a draw to try and undermine the effect of populism. And it led to the creation, really, of Jim Crow segregation and Jim Crow laws. It was part of the same package. So when they tell us these statues are about remembering things from our past, they're not simply remembrances, are they? They're about fighting for the present. So every statue that we're talking about now, we're not trying to rewrite the history. We're not trying to erase parts of the history. We're saying that these statues are serving a political purpose in the here and now. It's what do these statues represent in terms of the fight against racism now, the fight against imperialism now. It's not about us looking back and thinking, wouldn't it be nicer if we could whitewash our history and get rid of some of the nasty bits. It's about saying we want a better world in the here and now.
I just want to a few points about the two different movements in Rhodes Must Fall, one in South Africa, one in Oxford, because there's some interesting lessons, and I don't want to romanticise the South African movement because there are problems with it as well, but the Rhodes, sorry, I live in Oxford, so the Rhodes movement in Oxford was predominantly black-led, didn't really have open meetings, and when white socialists tried to go to these meetings, they were made to not feel very welcome. So there was a real Africanist, black nationalist, almost chauvinist bent to them, which I think wasn't very helpful. And neither did it reach out to the wider Oxford public, who is above the national level average of black and minority ethnic people. So I'm sure they'd have an interest in seeing Rhodes go. So there was no attempt to reach out there, no attempt to reach out to the UCU Union, no attempt to reach out to the Oxford Trades Council either, as far as I know. In South Africa, I know it's a slightly different situation, but the movement there did try a UCT and elsewhere, started off with Rhodes Must Fall, but eventually ended up with a Fees Must Fall, a national campaign that fed into the removal of the president. It wasn't the students that directly got rid of the president, but it fed into a wider movement. There's some interesting lessons there as well, and they also tried to feed into working with black workers who had ongoing campaigns on the campus in South Africa. However, what is also interesting about the South African movement is it's actually a wider reflection of a frustrated black middle class, which is linked to the politics of the ANC. And people were quite nervous about saying this in South Africa, particularly white leftists and other writers, because there's a heightened sense of Africanism, black nationalism in South Africa, which in one way is very good, but again is very problematic. And so this sort of Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall campaign is about a frustrated black middle class that Mandela's ANC has not brought enough rapid change. And so they when they're on their campuses in UCT, which is the Oxford and Cambridge of South Africa, they don't see any black professors. I don't think there's one, there certainly might be one or two black South African professors at UCT still. Any black professors at UCT are Nigerian or Ghanaian or something. They're not from South Africa, which shows the problems there. But it was an expression of a really frustrated black middle class who thought Mandela's ANC would bring in first, a black-led capitalism, and then there would be lots of change. That black middle class is extremely angry and frustrated, not about the lack of change for the wider working class, but about how their black middle class, the heirs to Mandela, have not really got their share of what they thought they were rightfully due.
Sometimes it's our heritage at falls. In Newport in South Wales, where there was the Chartist insurrection in 1839, we had a wonderful place called John Frost Square, and it was full of murals of John Frost and the workers leading the attack on the Westgate Hotel and trying to proclaim the Chartist Republic. And in 2011, John Frost Square was demolished and they destroyed the mural as well. Kenneth Budd's family, the family of the artist who created the mural, said, we would pay for it to be taken down and preserved. Nope, the council wasn't interested. They said, it stuck to the wall, it couldn't be preserved. It was on a wire mesh. And you can see this on YouTube. They pulled down the wire mesh and they are throwing it in a skip and breaking it up. They had absolutely no interest in preserving it. They just want to destroy it. There was a public outcry, said, we got to remember the Chartists some way. So in this new huge shopping centre, this fucking temple to commerce they built, there's a set of Chartist steps with the words of the People's Charter written on it. So you can walk all over the fucking People's Charter when you're shopping and celebrating capitalism. That's what they do. So we've got to protect our heritage as well.
Right, it's just a quick point. I'm Bobby Noyes from Southampton, SWP, and I've been really reading a lot of history in the last year. And one of the books I read was called Black Tudors. I don't know if anyone else here has read it. Yeah. And it's a fascinating book, and I would recommend people to read it, because what it's saying is, or it starts with Tudors, but we have a long, long history of black people in this country not associated with the slave trade, people who are working independently, some small farmers, I mean, people who are involved, particularly women, unfortunately, in exploitation. But it's a really good book. It's worth reading, and for me, it was particularly important because one of the first chapters talks about a deep-sea diver from the Guinea coast who was working for a Venetian, bringing up the guns from the Mary Rose, which is a really important part of our local history. So I would recommend people to read that, to read about the ordinary black people that have been in our country.
Let me add my thanks as well for the contributions, because I think it was a fabulous discussion, and indeed one that I learned from as well, which is, must mean it was a fantastic meeting. So just a few observations. And street names is absolutely part of the same debate and discussion. And one interesting observation, I went to, and someone asked the question about names as well, we should fight to change them. I'm glad that Rhodesia is no longer called Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. I'm glad it's got a different name. It's called Zimbabwe, of course. I want to say something about Zimbabwe because I went there a few years ago, and walking down these, kind of the main streets of Harare, the capital, was fascinating because the streets are named after really all of the big leaders of black liberation, the national liberation struggles in Africa. So you've got, Nelson Mandela Street, Kwame Nkrumah Street, Julius Nyerere, Gracia Machel. All of these people, the streets are named after these people, and it's interesting and fascinating to see that. But at the same time, it was a fascinating place to be because it looked, when I first went there, and it was the first time I'd been to an African country, just travelling out from the airport into the centre of Harare, it looked like any other capitalist city that I'd been to. The same international hotels, the same international banks and so on, but yet the street names are named after these revolutionary leaders. The business people were black business people in suits and so on, but the extraordinary thing was that after about 5:30, the place completely changed, and all of those business people went away from the air-conditioned offices and hotels, and the poor people who have to hawk and hustle to survive flocked into the city. And there were, every single day that I was there would be power cuts after about 5:30, and the power cuts would remain until the following morning. A measure of just how Peter talked about the frustrations of sections of society at the hope that the struggles for liberation would lead to them being uplifted, and those hopes and aspirations just haven't been achieved. It's an indication, isn't it, that we need to do much more than simply change the names of things. We have to change, and we have to transform society. And it's good that there has been certain amounts of levels of progress, the things that people have talked about where changes have occurred. I think the library in Dalston is named after C.L.R. James, isn't it? That's a good thing. Where I live in South London, the fact that I can walk down the road to Brixton and there is the Black Cultural Archives is a good thing. In fact, actually, if you walk just across a couple of roads from here, there is a plaque commemorating Bob Marley. And the fact Bob Marley lived and hung around here, I think that's a good thing. I think the fact you walk around Ladbroke Grove and there is a plaque commemorating Kelso Cochrane, the Caribbean carpenter who was one of the first people murdered in a racist attack here in the 1950s, and who the struggle to commemorate people like him was what led to the Notting Hill Carnival. Those are, good and important things. I hope that there will be an appropriate commemoration to the victims of the Grenfell Tower atrocity in years to come. But that is something that the community has to be involved in developing and debating and discussing. And, you know, of course, the argument, you know, the arguments that have been put by the likes of the Rhodes Must Fall campaigners isn't simply that the statue should come down. Some people have argued that we don't even want to necessarily, we're not bothered about, regardless of whether, as John suggested, they have any kind of artistic merit at all. People are saying, we're not saying smash them, take them down, put them in a museum, and we can have a debate and a discussion about their role in history. So it's not about just smashing and completely whitewashing history. It is about having that whole history. Mary raised the question about what to do with these works of art in galleries and so on. Now, because I'm a lawyer, so I can't possibly encourage people to go and commit criminal damage. I couldn't possibly do that. But in a sense, you know, the real point has to be this, isn't it? If that is all that people do, go in and you know, take that kind of direct action, then it may capture attention, it may, you know, encourage and enthuse a few people, but is it going to be part of a broader, wider movement of struggle for a different society? And I think that's why I think the points that Peter raised about concretely what's happened in Oxford are really quite interesting. It's disappointing to hear that the campaign didn't really reach out to the wider working class movement, the trade unions, the wider community in Oxford and so on, because if the kind of protests that can be inspirational, as they have been, are going to be more than just tokenistic, you know, important though they may be for the people who are involved in them, but if they are going to be something more than that, if they are going to be, as we know, there needs to be a fight and a struggle for a different society. If they're going to make a contribution to that struggle, then they necessarily do need to reach out beyond the campuses and reach out to and connect with the wider struggles, the Black Lives Matter struggle, working class struggles, the things that are happening at the moment, the protests against Trump, against the fascists, and the fascists who, of course, would seek to protect and preserve that rotten racist heritage. These kind of campaigns have to be part of that wider movement, and that, therefore, I think has to be the message that we take out and raise with the people that we come into contact with who are part of those kinds of campaigns. Yeah, I think that'll do. Thank you.